Let's turn our attention to politics locally, and Ben Oquist, David Gazzard join me as they do every week. The Treasurer to give a speech tomorrow, I guess setting the scene. We've seen this before with Treasurers, as you would have known, David, over the years, setting the scene ahead of what is undoubtedly the biggest test of Josh Frydenberg's career.
Josh has had the responsibility of managing the books through a really quite a unique crisis, hasn't he? And it's a normal thing for treasurers to come out and sort of provide a bit of a framework around the thinking behind it. And there's some of the commitments the budget's likely to make have already been made, but it looks to me like there's an extension of what the government has successfully done this far, and that is providing the stimulus to keep businesses and Australians in jobs and you know, ultimately contributing members of society so the economy can continue to function. So
it can't be just about tax cuts, though, can it? They've got to be. They've got to have some significant spending too.
Absolutely, and I think there will be spending made on productive infrastructure, things that are shovel-ready, things that will provide jobs, things that will help the productive capacity of the economy longer term. So road links that are necessary, energy projects that are warranted and needed, things that will help build business and create jobs and economic growth through the future.
The debt and deficit rhetoric has gone in the face of this pandemic recession.
Yeah, the worry is it'll come back after we get the tax cuts. So if they put the tax cuts in now, so we don't have to worry about debt and deficit. The thing about tax cuts is they're not temporary and they're not targeted. And the government said its support for the economy will be temporary and targeted. And of course, tax cuts aren't targeted and they're permanent. So the damage to the revenue base is done long term. And I think that's the big problem with these tax cuts. I don't think it's possible for the government just to bring forward stage 2 of the tax cuts or stage 2 and 3, because people forget that stage 2 and 3 only go to people essentially over 90 grand. I don't think he can stand up there on budget night and say tax cuts for people over 90 grand. The bottom half miss out. Our analysis out recently shows that 80% goes to the top 20%. The bottom half get 3% of those tax cuts. Women get 30% of them. Men get 70%. So I predict he will not just bring forward stage 2 of the tax cuts. It'll have to be something different. It doesn't work. And the long-term damage that those tax cuts cause to our revenue base is the big problem. There needs to be stuff, and they're likely to be saved, not spent. So to your point, there needs to be stuff done on the spending side. I think the problem the government's got is that we've got this big fiscal cliff for the December quarter. On current estimates, some 30 to 50 billion less from the government going in. As David said, the economy needs stimulus. How, on a budget that comes down the beginning of October, do you get money out in the December quarter for infrastructure projects? It's very difficult to get it out that fast.
And Ben had me at permanent tax cuts. I say yes, permanent tax cuts, and it may be a loss to revenue, but it's a gain to the taxpayer, whose money it is in the first place. And if anyone knows how to spend their money, it's the taxpayer, right? And in terms of stimulating the economy, which is, you know, run off a progressive base, so the people who possibly could make the biggest tax cuts pay by far and away the greatest lion's share of tax anyway. But putting more money in their hands to spend as they see fit will be the greatest boon to the economy you can unleash.
So do you think there should be extensions at the lower end, though, as Ben's alluding to there? He wants a greater benefit to those on lower income.
I don't know how the complexion of the tax cuts will come, if they'll come at all, but all I'm saying is, yes, there should be tax cuts. Yes, they should be permanent. One of the things that, you know, I think irritates taxpayers is that the money isn't given back, and if it is taken in terms of revenue, it goes in areas where they never see the benefit. So this is money in their pocket to spend as they see fit, and that provides the efficient distribution of money through the economy in the first place.
Two things though, David. Don't ever come in here in a few years' time and complain about debt and deficit after backing in tax cuts now that will permanently damage the revenue base of Australia. So you can't on the one hand say debt and deficit is a real big worry and yet back in a $300 billion income tax cut plan that will make deficit obviously worse. Secondly,
you would have the economy that would grow the fastest then would be the highest taxed economy, and that has not proven to be the case anywhere it's been tried.
Actually,
the lower the tax base, the more efficient the allocation. As provided you've got a safety net that's fair, and we can debate about that, but. Big spending, central governments, and you'll come at me with Sweden and Norway and some of these other places.
The richest countries in the world, the highest growth rates, the happiest people, have a much higher tax rate than Australia. Yes, Nordic countries have higher taxes than Australia. Yes, Nordic countries have higher wages than Australia. Yes, Nordic countries have happier people than Australia. Yes, Nordic countries have a better health system.
Happier? I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, the happiest people in the world, according to all the international surveys.
I thought that was the...
I'll let you run on... We'll raise your taxes at the next election, and I'll go for a tax cut.
You can talk about the politics of it. I'm talking about the economics and the well-being of society. I'm telling you that if you give big tax cuts to rich people, they're more likely to save them than spend them. The economy needs fiscal stimulus, aggregate demand support now. The tax cuts are the worst option if that is your goal.
Let's look at the energy debate, because we're going to get to NBN in a moment, but on the energy debate, this to me, it's been criticised by some on on the left and the right. I think you've got the Greens and others who have been critical, and on the right, some of the Nats have been critical. But to me, this actually is a signpost of a coalition showing, progress in terms of this area and emissions reduction that I wouldn't have imagined possible a couple of years ago, in terms of a big focus on battery storage. And on and other technology, green steel, that sort of stuff. I mean, a few years ago, they wouldn't. If the coalition was putting money into this, people would have squealed. Has it been because you've got a Conservative as Energy Minister that there's been some progress?
I think that's right. I think Angus has done this really well, but it is, as you rightfully point out, possibly an agnostic policy. There's no particular bias to one source of energy over the other. But I think it is that we've now come a long way down the track, and we've crossed the Rubicon beyond the point where you need subsidies to get these forms of energy up. So they're up. They have cut the cost of energy at certain points of the day. And there's no point looking in the rear view mirror and having ideological wars over subsidies that occurred back in the early 2000s.
It's done.
We are where we are now, and there are ways you can drive efficiencies and benefits at very low cost out of the energy sources that are there.
And if they're successful, Ben, you're talking about, the roadmap suggests emissions reductions to the order of, I think it was 240 million tonnes of emissions by 2040. That would be a significant step forward if these... And that's only with these technologies we're talking about, not beyond that, where there would be further savings, you'd think.
Well, I think there's a really interesting point you raised, that they do talk about, the only thing they talk about is emission reductions per year by 2040. So in their own documentation, they say there is no emission reductions by 2030. So on the one hand, the government makes all this fuss about its 2030 target, and that being the important thing, not having a net zero 2050 target, which everybody wants, from the Business Council of Australia to the farmers to the Greens to Labor to investors. They say they can't do that. We're only focusing on 2030. If they produce a technology roadmap that only has emission reductions for 2040, essentially not driving emissions to 2030. The other thing that I thought was really disappointing about this, I mean, it is about picking winners. It's not, it picks 5 technologies out of 160.
But from your perspective, it could have been a lot worse.
Oh, absolutely.
And do you see what I'm saying in terms of the coalition making... They've certainly moved on their sort of emissions debate, their terrain has moved in the last few years.
Well, I think the proof of that, potentially, I'm not sure, is in Matt Canavan attacking it for not being pro-coal enough. And that is a sign that they're edging away from coal. But on those they haven't stopped wasting money. Think about clean coal. Not one clean coal project for coal in Australia, despite $1.3 billion and 20 years. They highlight that as a technology that we need to invest in, and not electric vehicles. Electric vehicles which would help decarbonise our transport sector, which are going gangbusters overseas. We need some incentives and electric vehicle policy for our transport sector. they leave EVs off, but put carbon capture and storage in. I think that's a mistake.
Ben and David, unfortunately, we're out of